Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I want to ask you something before we even get started today. Think about the last time you saw an ambulance fly by, lights blazing, sirens wailing. You probably just moved out of the way and didn't think too much about it, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. But here's the thing, that ambulance, those paramedics, the very idea that a trained medical professional can stabilize you on the way to the hospital, all of that traces back to a group of Black men and women from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that the rest of the city had basically written off. And that is not hyperbole. That is literally the history. And it is one of those stories that will have you equal parts inspired and infuriated because of what happened to them.
It's a great story. So for today, for Black History Month, we're talking about the Freedom House Ambulance Service. They are the first paramedics in America. We're talking about the racist system they were born out of and the genius they brought to medicine, the lives that they saved, and then the way the system came back around and tried to erase them.
And I have to say, I went through medical training at UPMC in Pittsburgh. Peter Safar's photo hung in our main lecture hall at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. The Peter Safar Center of Resuscitation Research is literally named after him. And even I, with all of that exposure, didn't know the full Freedom House story until recently. That says everything.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I heard of Dr. Safar as well before in residency training. We learned about him. But we're going to fix that today. We need everyone to learn about the Freedom House.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we get to the heroes of this story, we need to set the scene because the world of emergency medicine before the late 1960s,
Yeek.
absolutely wild,
Yeah.
and not in a good way.
No, not. This was surprising. So picture this. It's 1965 and you are having a heart attack or a stroke, which doesn't happen in the hospital. You're outside the hospital. So what do? Somebody calls for help and guess who shows up? Who shows up?
The police in a paddy wagon.
Yep, in a paddy wagon. In a paddy wagon. That's the same vehicle they used to transport people they arrested or to collect dead bodies. There was little to no medical equipment in any of these vehicles, like oxygen, defibrillators, the things that we think of, nothing.
Yep.
The police aren't medically trained. They're basically like a really fast taxi, and that too, not a very comfortable one. Other transporters were like volunteer firefighters, sometimes even funeral directors, which is so morbid when you think about it, and like private companies, but totally ill-equipped for the medical needs of the community at that time.
And John Moon, who was one of the Freedom House most iconic paramedics, he had a name for it. He called it the swoop and scoop.
Swoop
'Cause
and
that's what
scoop.
they were, swoop and scoop them up. That's what they were doing. They would swoop and scoop
Yeah.
these people off the streets, rush them to the hospital, and that was the entire medical intervention. That was it.
Isn't that wild? I mean, as doctors, I need everybody to understand what that means. You know that the time between a medical emergency starts and the treatment, that gap, like every minute, every second counts. So if you're having a heart attack, every minute of delay of care means that the heart muscle is dying. If
Yeah.
you're having a stroke, the brain cells are dying by the millions every minute from anoxic brain injury, okay? If you're having an asthma attack, you can go from breathing to not breathing in minutes, and you need immediate treatment. So swoop and scoop was not really a system. It was really a death sentence delayed.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reality was that this was very bad for everybody, regardless of race. It was a nationwide crisis. In 1966, the National Academy of Sciences actually published a paper calling accidental death and inadequate ambulance care the neglected disease of modern society. Up to 50,000 deaths per year were blamed on this gap.
Yeah. I actually remember hearing that they had better outcomes in the Vietnam War because there were medics on site than they did in these communities in the United States, which is kind of wild. But imagine this for Black communities. It was catastrophically worse because the police, who were really your only option, they often just didn't come. Or they'd
Mhm.
show up and instead of helping, they would get hostile. Or they
Right.
decide that someone who was clearly having a medical emergency was actually drunk or they appear drunk to them. And they would just leave. So if your relationship with law enforcement was already fraught, which it was at that time, and in Pittsburgh Hill District in the 1960s, it absolutely was. Calling the police in an emergency was genuinely terrifying and probably a last resort.
Absolutely. So you had a system that was inadequate for everyone, that
Sure.
was deadly for Black communities specifically, and nobody in power seemed particularly interested in fixing it. Does this sound familiar?
Sadly so, it does.
So into this mess walks Dr. Peter Safar. And I want to talk about who this man was because he was genuinely extraordinary. And his story is also heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's actually a really tragic story.
Yeah.
Dr. Safar was an Australian born anesthesiologist who came to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. He's credited as being the father of CPR. He was actually nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine 3 times. And he established the first ICU, intensive care unit,
Yeah.
in the United States. So he is an absolute pioneer. And Dion, I know you trained there, but like, how wild is it knowing that this man walked those halls and you're an anesthesiologist too now?
I know, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
It's surreal. And as I said, his portrait was in Scaife Hall. That was like our main lecture hall
Yeah.
in medical school. And Peter Safar Center of Resuscitation Research is named after him.
Right.
But here's the thing, even with all of those things visible, the Freedom House chapter of his life was not so visible. His legacy was something we didn't discuss enough, and that's a whole other conversation.
That we're gonna have.
Oh,
So
yeah, definitely.
So Safar had already been pushing for a reformed ambulance standards for years. So he was already on this soapbox where he was looking at the situation and he was like, we need to remedy this, the whole out of the hospital resuscitation. But he kept hitting walls because the medical community, like the establishment, said that only doctors could provide medical care. I do not find this shocking at all, by the way. But local firefighters unions didn't want to be trained or retrained. And the mayor said it was the county's problem. So it's a lot of bureaucratic blocking and red tape that he's not able to push through because nobody wants all this extra training and extra work.
Right, right. And there are two moments that transform this from a professional crusade into something very personal for him.
Hmm.
The first was the death of David L. Lawrence, the former governor of Pennsylvania and former mayor of Pittsburgh. In 1966, Governor Lawrence had a heart attack mid speech right there in Pittsburgh. He was transported in a police wagon, which was the standard of care at the time. There was actually a nurse who happened to be there. She just happened to be there. And luckily for him, well, kind of, but she was able to do CPR and accompanied him to the hospital. However, in the police wagon, there was broken equipment. The police wagon was swaying left and right, and she wasn't able to be stable while performing CPR. So it wasn't effective CPR. And by the time they reached the hospital, he was already brain dead and he died 5 days later.
Yeah. And I believe when I watched the documentary, it was Dr. Safar happened to be there as well.
Yes, he did.
And so it wasn't that he couldn't stabilize him, but he had already had so much anoxic, brain injury that he didn't have function and he did die. The
That time
second
factor,
The time factor
right?
is huge, right? The second moment was very personal to Dr. Safar. Apparently, he and his wife were out of town for a medical convention, and his 11-year-old daughter suffered a very severe asthma attack. And she was loaded into one of the standard vehicles. No albuterol, no oxygen, nothing. And so by the time she arrived at the hospital, she had suffered brain injury as well from the lack of oxygen. And her brain, had been starved and of this oxygen that we all need and for too long. And she died as well, which is so tragic.
Oh, man. That is so sad. I mean, as a doctor, as a mother, I can't imagine going through that. And I actually understand how those two events kind of led to what we know about him today. He watched the very system that he's been fighting against take his own child.
Mhm.
But his pain became his fuel. And here's where it gets a little wild because Dr. Safar had already been doing some research that was, let's say, ahead of its time. Um, Probably would not pass any ethical board review today, but it was important work nonetheless.
Oh, yeah, man. He went completely rogue.
Yeah,
You need to watch these videos if you haven't seen them. But basically, Dr. Safar was trying to prove that you didn't need to be a doctor to provide basic life saving care. And to demonstrate this, he literally conducted experiments on volunteers. I mean, they were volunteers.
they were.
They were given anesthetics, like sedating and paralyzing agents so that they weren't able to move or breathe on their own. And then he had lay people, like totally non medical people, demonstrate that they could ventilate these patients and keep them breathing.
Absolutely wild, like you said. And in this documentary that we both watched, there's actual footage of a Boy Scout, a child, using what looks like, a basic oral airway device
Right.
to ventilate a fully grown adult man, a grown man receiving oxygen from a child. It was, wow,
It's
it was
enlightening.
extraordinary. But yeah, absolutely.
It's incredible. And it's also would never get approved by the IRB today, like ever.
No.
But the
Mm-mm.
point is profound that basic life-saving skills are learnable by anyone.
Right.
You don't need a medical degree. You just need training and the right tools. I mean, think about everybody who's now BLS trained or ACLS trained. You don't need to be a doctor to have this training.
I mean, there's an AED in any public setting.
Exactly.
So he really transformed, emergency care
And the
outside of the
framework,
hospital.
like how we think
That's
about
right.
this.
That's
Yeah.
right. So basically, that's literally the foundation of the entire paramedic profession. And it's what made everything that came next possible.
Right. And so this is part 2 of the story. Let's introduce everyone to the Freedom House Enterprises. We got to talk about what the Freedom House was and where it came from.
Freedom House Enterprises was founded in 1966 in Pittsburgh's Hill District. The Hill was and remains a historically Black neighborhood, and in the 1960s, it was deeply underserved. And unemployment in Pittsburgh was sitting at around 14%. Freedom House was created with a federal grant under President Johnson's War on Poverty initiative. Its mission was job training, economic uplift, community services, things like food delivery, voter registration, organizing, NAACP chapter meetings. It was about building up a community that the city had abandoned.
Truly abandoned. And you can see that in
Mhm.
the documentary. The founder of the Freedom House Enterprises was James McCoy Jr., and he was a steelworkers union leader and a community activist. This man is very committed to his community. And another man at that time was also equally committed was Phil Hallen. And he's a
Mhm.
white man. He's a Yale educated public health graduate who also ran the Maurice Falk Medical Fund, which is basically this foundation that supported job building and medical initiatives in Pittsburgh. And he saw firsthand how bad it was, especially in communities like the Hill District. So this is like the perfect storm of people, the right people meeting each other at the right time.
Absolutely. So Halen had this idea. He approached James McCoy at Freedom House and said, essentially, what if an ambulance service could provide jobs for unemployed people in the Hill District and also provide emergency medical services that the community is being denied? Two problems, one solution.
Yeah, so they approached Dr. Safar, who had already been knocking doors trying to find a way to run this kind of pilot program. And they took the idea to the city. And at that time, President Johnson had a war on poverty, their money, funding flowing. And the city agreed to contract with the Freedom House to test out this pilot program.
So let's just pause here because I love this detail. The
Okay.
people that the city labeled as unemployable, I mean, that's the term that they used in the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
These people became the founders of a medical system the whole world would copy. Let that sink in because that's huge.
It's huge. And the funny thing is some of these recruits, originally the 25 Black men from the Hill were, in the words of one recruit, they were recruited off the streets. Some of them
Yeah.
were returning from Vietnam. They were veterans. They were struggling with reintegration. Some had never even considered a career in medicine. One of the most famous was a young man named John Moon. He grew up right there in the Hill District and watched his community being neglected firsthand. He was so young when he joined the Freedom House, I think in the 2022.
hmm
Yeah.
2022 and about to help invent a whole new profession.
Okay.
That's big.
It is, but here's where it gets really exciting because Safar didn't just throw these folks in an ambulance and hope for the best. He and a team of physicians, including Dr. Nancy Caroline, who is known as the mother of paramedicine, developed a really rigorous 32-week training program, and it included 300 hours of classroom and clinical experience. So they really were undergoing rigorous training to prepare for being paramedics.
For context, nobody had done this before. The curriculum that Dr. Safar and Dr. Nancy Caroline helped create literally became the federal standard for paramedic training in America in 1975. Dr. Nancy Caroline wrote the book literally. It was called Emergency Care in the Streets, and it became the textbook of paramedicine across the country.
Yeah, and it was rigorous. I mean, these
Yeah.
men were trained, they said, in anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, CPR, intubation. That means putting in a breathing tube to keep someone's airway open so they can ventilate. Cardiac care. They were in ICUs. They did IV drug administration, how to read an EKG in the field. They were doing things that no ambulance crew anywhere in America had ever done.
They started in 1968 with just two ambulances. Two. They responded to nearly 5,800 calls in the first year and transported more than 4,600 patients. And according to the data that Dr. Safar collected, they saved 200 lives in their first year alone. That's
That's so impressed.
a
200 lives in 1 year from
pilot
2
program.
ambulances in one neighborhood. This is one neighborhood.
Right, right, right. And the firsts they racked up were staggering. Freedom House paramedics performed the first on field intubation in American history. The first is credited to John Moon, who we mentioned earlier. They were the first to administer Narcan, that's naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, in the field. They were the first to use a defibrillator in the field to shock a cardiac arrest patient, the first to read and interpret an EKG outside of a hospital. They brought the hospital to the streets.
Yeah. It's so impressive. And I want to give a quick shout out to something absolutely wild that they did in 1973 during the heroin crisis in Pittsburgh. There was
Mhm.
a deadly surge in overdoses. And the Freedom House paramedics didn't just respond to those overdose calls, they actually went and talked to local drug dealers. They made an agreement. If someone overdoses, just call us. They will not bring the police. They're out to save lives, no legal repercussions. And guess what? The fatal overdoses dropped.
That is harm reduction before harm reduction was even a policy framework. These people were innovating in real time in the community based on trust, something the police could never have done.
Yeah, you know what's crazy? The same police who used to ignore calls from the Hill District, they started calling Freedom House for backup for their own emergencies. You had white collars often specifically requested the Freedom House over police transport. Even the police officers themselves, for their own personal reasons, called the Freedom House. That's how good they
That
were.
That is excellence forcing its way through prejudice, okay? That's what competence and care can do. But of course, a lot of people in the white communities in Pittsburgh didn't like this. This is where systematic racism shows up again, just like it always does, right when something beautiful is happening.
Yeah, because keep in mind that now the Freedom House is really thriving. They were the gold standard. Their model was being studied and it was being adopted by emergency services across the country. But then the city got a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. White neighborhoods started complaining. Their
hmm
complaints were that this is unfair, that the Hill District, a Black neighborhood, was getting better emergency care than they were. Now, the mayor, Pittsburgh Mayor Peter Flaherty, elected in 1969, had a choice. Okay. He could have said, "You're right. The service is exceptional. Let's expand it citywide. Hire more Freedom House paramedics, scale the model, give everyone this level of care."
But nope. Instead
But
of
nope.
expanding the program in 1975, he cut their funding. The city of Pittsburgh announced it was starting its own EMS service, Pittsburgh Emergency Medical Services, run by white personnel. And the chief of that new service had trained under the Freedom House.
So let me repeat that. The man placed in charge of the new city funded, predominantly white EMS service learned what he knew from the Black paramedics he is now being elevated above.
Yeah, this is really tragic because I think what I learned from the documentary is they had even made a whole plan on how to take their project and expand it, and it was just completely scrapped and ignored.
Yep. Knocked down.
Mhm.
Mm.
And with some of the Freedom House paramedics were offered positions in the new Pittsburgh EMS, but there was supposedly a written agreement that their previous training and experience would be acknowledged and recognized. But, surprise, surprise, it was not. And many were immediately reassigned to non medical duties. Others were subjected to like additional training requirements that their white counterparts weren't even being asked to complete. So it was basically a way to weed them out and frustrate them so badly that it would force them into leaving instead of staying. That was the technique that they
Yeah.
used.
And it worked. A
Mhm.
huge number of Freedom House paramedics left emergency services entirely, which is so sad. These pioneers, these trailblazers, people who literally invented the job got pushed out. And the ones who stayed were denied any path to leadership. One of the members who started at age 19, George McCary III, ended up leaving and becoming a cab driver. And no shade to cab driving at all. Every profession has honor, but you could see his sadness narrating the story because you knew he felt fulfilled serving his community as a paramedic.
Absolutely. And the one exception notable was the Freedom House member John Moon. He was the gentleman who had the first intubation in the field, who had been with the Freedom House since he was like 22 years old. He persisted through all of it. He spent 35 years with the Pittsburgh EMS. He retired as assistant chief. It took 35 years to rise to assistant chief from when he started in the very system his community built, which is
Yeah.
so sad. John Moon, by the way, has been credited as the first person, like I said, for the field intubation. But for it to take this long to climb up the ranks is quite telling of the system.
It truly is. And I mean, it was not until 2019, the year my 6-year-old daughter was born, that Pittsburgh EMS had its first Black chief. The paramedic profession in Pittsburgh was created by Black people. And it took that many decades for a Black person to hold the top position in that city. That is not a coincidence, guys. That is a system doing exactly what systems are designed to do when they are built on inequality.
Yeah, and even worse, when the Freedom House was gone, the Black community in Pittsburgh suffered immediately. They felt the immediate effects of them being gone because the new Pittsburgh EMS brought all the racism of the old police system with it. There are documented cases of Black patients being denied transportation, cases where the EMS personnel told Black families that a sickle cell crisis was not a medical emergency, which is not only completely wrong, it's also dangerous and
Very.
could be fatally wrong.
Very. Sickle cell crisis, not an emergency. That is medical racism. And it echoes something we still see today because we cannot talk about this history without talking about Elijah McClain. In 2019, in Aurora, Colorado, Elijah McClain was a 23-year-old Black man who was stopped by police while walking home. He was not armed. He was not breaking any laws. The officers called EMS, and the EMS response in that situation was grossly negligent. He was given a sedative, ketamine, at a dose far exceeding what his body weight warranted. He went into cardiac arrest. He died because of poor care. This case still haunts me today
Yeah, on
because it's
so
a
many
modern day
levels.
case. Hmm.
Yeah, ketamine, a drug that we use all the time as anesthesiologists. And Freedom House was built specifically to be the antidote to this particular kind of neglect and harm. And when they were
Yes.
dismantled, that barrier between Black people, that community, and a safe, dignified medical care, that barrier just went right back up again.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. But okay. We need to come back to celebration mode because despite everything, the erasure, the racism, the injustice, the legacy of the Freedom House cannot be erased. It literally lives in every ambulance that rolls by any city.
Yeah, we owe a lot to Dr. Safar. The ambulance design standards that he pioneered were adopted as the national standard in 1975, ironically, the same year that the Freedom House was shut down. The paramedic training across the United States was standardized by and developed by Dr. Nancy Caroline. That was a major win. And every paramedic who has ever intubated a patient in the field, read an EKG, administered Narcan, shocked heart rate back into normal sinus rhythm, they owe that to the Freedom House.
Yes, they do. The model they built was a blueprint for everyone around the world. Countries looked at what Freedom House did and built their emergency system in those with those foundations. And sadly, most people and most medical students, most EMTs, most emergency physicians have no idea.
So there's some really good news on a visibility front. If you watch The Pit on HBO Max, super popular, the medical drama set in Pittsburgh, episode 8 in season 1 has a whole storyline specifically about the Freedom House ambulance. And a medical advisor on that show, Dr. Sylvia Owusu Ansah from the University of Pittsburgh, brought that story into the writer's room. And so now millions of people are encountering the Freedom House for the first time through the show. Because again, representation matters, memory matters. And if you want to go deeper, we strongly recommend that you do. WKQED produced a 30-minute documentary called Freedom House Ambulance, The First Responders. It features John Moon, George McCary III, Mitch Brown, and the original founder, Phil Hallen. It is extraordinary. It's a must-see. You should watch it, particularly if you are in the medical field.
There's also some written material recently published by the New York Times and on the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, Department of Anesthesiologists and Perioperative Medicine's page. And I want to say something directly as a Black woman because it's so incredibly personal to me. We are living in a moment where there are active efforts in this country to erase Black history from curricula, to dismiss the contributions of Black and Brown people in American life. And this story is a perfect example of why that effort is so dangerous. Because if you erase Freedom House and all they did and stood for, you erase the foundings of modern EMS. You erase the people who gave us a system that has saved millions of lives. I can't even imagine a world without ambulances, and we
Yeah.
can't let that stand.
That's true. Not on this podcast. Here,
Yeah.
we want to give everybody and everyone their proper due. We honor the people who built things that the rest of the world benefited from, especially when they were denied the credit, the leadership, and the dignity that they deserved.
Absolutely. To John Moon, to George McCary III, to Mitch Brown, to every Freedom House paramedic who ran those 5,800 calls in their first year, who intubated and defibrillated and administered Narcan in the field, in a car, on a sidewalk, when no one in medicine had ever done it before them. We thank you.
Yes. And to Dr. Safar, Dr. Nancy Caroline, who wrote the book, literally, and to Phil Hallen and James McCoy Jr., who saw that two impossible problems could become one extraordinary solution. We thank you as well.
Happy Black History Month, everyone. Thank you so much for listening today. Share this episode. Tell someone the Freedom House story, because that's how we make sure it's never forgotten again.
Yeah, and the next time an ambulance flies past you, you'll know.
Awesome.